And we're on Facebook. We're also recording this tonight. So welcome everyone to this conversation about the ethical and justice concerns of oil and gas and the connection that we hope to be making with that, with the Green Amendment. And we're real pleased tonight to have a great group of panelists. But before we begin that, I'd like to just center us with a short reflection, and it's from Jack Kornfield, who is a Buddhist teacher. My simple prayer is that in all things I learn to love well, that I learn to touch the ever-changing seasons of life with a great heart of compassion, that I live with the peace and justice I wish for the earth, that I learn to care fully and let go gracefully, that I enjoy the abundance of the earth and return to it from the natural generosity that is our human birthright. That through my own life, through joy and sorrow, in thought and word and deed, I bring benefit and blessings to all lives. So our presentation tonight, our being together tonight, is one for life and for healing and for moving deeper into a place of respecting all peoples, all races, all creatures, and this common home that we share. So our panel tonight, and they're going to be in this order, so I'm just going to say a couple things about them. They can say more about themselves if they want when it's their turn. And each of them are going to have between 5 and 8 minutes to speak. And so our first panelist is Nathalie Eddy, and I feel real pleased to be working with her with the Citizens Caring for the Future in Southeast New Mexico. And she's the field representative with Earthworks in New Mexico and Colorado. And Nick King, who's not quite with us yet here, is a Mennonite pastor in Carlsbad, and he's on the leadership team of Citizens Caring for the Future. Larry Rasmussen, we're also so pleased that he is so connected with Interfaith Power and Light here in New Mexico. He is an internationally noted author, lecturer, and earth ethicist. And he's the Reinhold Niebuhr Professor of Ethics Emeritus at Union Theological Seminary. So we're very pleased to have Larry with us. And Terry Sloan is a board member of New Mexico Interfaith Power and Light. And he is the director of Southwest Cultures, and he is of Navajo and Hopi lineage. And he also works with the city of Albuquerque on inclusion, cultural inclusion and racial equity, and has been very connected with the Green Amendment. And then we're very pleased to have Maya von Rossum all the way from Pennsylvania here, and she's the founder of the Green Amendment for the Generations Movement, and she's the author of the Green Amendment. And so we're very pleased to have all of them here. And so we'll begin with you, Nathalie.
Wonderful, thanks. You've got my presentation there, I think, Joan.
I do, just a second here. Oh, I lost it. No. Where did it go? Shoot. Just a second. I had it here earlier and it disappeared.
Do you want me to start, Joan, and while you look for that, or
No. I got it.
Great.
There we go.
Great. Thanks, Joan. And you gonna put it into slide mode, or does that work this way? That should work if that.
I don't see how to do that here. Open with Google Slides. Oh, I probably lost it now. Oh, there.
There you go.
Slideshow.
Right.
Now you have to do the slideshow.
That looks,
I can't do that on this. It's a different.
I think that's fine. Whatever
That's the only way I
can see, it's perfect.
Yeah, that's fine. That's the only way I can do it.
Thank you, Joan. And thank you so much for inviting me to join tonight. Joan asked me to give a bit of a kind of a lay of the land of oil and gas in New Mexico with a particular focus on the Permian. I decided to interpret that as a chance to do a Zoom trip to the oil and gas fields, which is sort of a field trip, but more comfortable because you're not in the oil and gas fields. You get to be in your home with the screen. But before kind of going through some of these images and some of our experiences, I do think I'm so thankful to be having this conversation and thinking about ethical and justice issues as we take on oil and gas and confront some of the challenges and harms that many of us see and feel or hear about from communities. So maybe I'll go ahead and get started with the slides, but I'm thankful to have some new and thoughtful and proactive, positive energy and thoughts going into this challenge. So just to start, I think it's always hard, and I'm on a constant learning curve. I guess I should introduce myself too. I'm a field advocate with Earthworks. I live in Colorado and I work in Colorado, New Mexico, and I work. The two main components of my work are field work and working with communities impacted by oil and gas. And the field work involves going out into the field and documenting the pollution that we see, and I'll show you more of what we find. And so to me, getting my head around the enormity of this challenge and the number of oil and gas sites in New Mexico is a hard thing to do. And so I've tried to sort of share some different ways of visually looking at this as a way to kind of setting the stage for tonight's conversation. And so on this first slide, you're seeing what, if for folks who live in either corner of New Mexico, are probably familiar with pump jacks on the right here, and then there's a drill rig and some could be water or waste hoses in the foreground of the photo on the left with the oil and gas truck. And so these are kind of sites that many people might see commuting to school or work in any of the active oil and gas areas in New Mexico. Next slide, please. So this is just a snapshot of kind of what you start to see in terms of the density when you look overhead. These are both of the Permian. One is just out the window of a plane, and then one on the right, this is just north of Carlsbad, and you can see the little vehicle. So we're using Google Maps or something, and all of a sudden realized the image of the map was just kind of mind-blowing. You can see we're literally sort of surrounded. We've probably lost our way, but it's so many different ways of trying to get around the actual numbers here. Next slide. Two more images from different parts of the state. On the left is a drill rig in Counselor in the Chaco area. And then on the right is a compressor station and a truck. And I think we're kind of standing in a community member's front yard. We were taking some air samples that day, and we're looking back at this sort of the skyline. But these are the things that have become all too common for so many frontline communities in New Mexico. And then you get up a little closer and you start to see, you know, on the left here, this is a super old sign. These are in the legacy fields north of Carlsbad, and things are rusting out. On the right there is a site that's still actually in production, but you can see spills on the ground. This was a very smelly site. So it starts to look less and less like the picture we want, and more like something very dangerous and harmful to our communities and climate. So what we do with Earthworks is we work with thermographers, and thermographers are trained to use optical gas imaging cameras. This is a type of camera that regulators, so the state agencies and industry use to find leaks on their site. And it makes the otherwise invisible pollution visible. And so what we're seeing in this slide here, on the left side is what we could see with a normal camera with the naked eye. And on the right lower corner, you see what the camera exposes, which is a huge plume carrying off site. And this is likely, so this is an unlit flare. Flares are meant to be combusting oil and gas. And what it is basically just an open vent with a huge plume that we can see thanks to this technology. So we sort of went from the ground of what we can see. This is a view from what the agency, how the agency sees it in New Mexico, the Oil Conservation Division. The main takeaway from this is that there are 65,000 active wells in New Mexico. A third of them are up in the northwest corner in the Chaco Four Corners area, and 2/3 are down in the Permian, split between basically sort of Carlsbad and Hobbs in Eddy and Lee counties. And then another way to look at this is, so just more maps, and we're seeing the density in the corners of the state. This is the oil and gas threat map, which shows us that there are 138,000 people in New Mexico living within half a mile of active oil and gas sites. In terms of who's impacted and what this looks like. And so sort of more numbers that I'm chopping in different ways. This one we're on now is another map, and we're seeing that density. Again, 65,000 active sites in the state. And there are 2 agencies that are supposed to be the oversight agencies for oil and gas in New Mexico. One is the Oil Conservation Division and one is the Environment Department. OCD has 9 inspectors and NMED has 7. And so what that last slide was just a snapshot of is just how outmatched those agencies are and how many sites go unchecked every year. And probably for years, there isn't anyone taking note and seeing what's out there. Thanks, Joan. Don't need to see all these numbers here, but the main takeaway is, so we know that the inspections and enforcement is outmatched by the volume in New Mexico. And it's not looking good. There are lots of problems. These are the spills and excess emissions as reported by industry. So there are likely higher figures in terms of what's actually happening. This is what the operators are reporting. And if you look in just Eddy and Lee County alone, the columns on the left side there, there are more than daily spills. Almost twice a day there's a spill in each county. And then in terms of excess emissions, similarly, almost more than once a day, if not 2 or 3 times a day, there are exceedances of emissions, which are upsets where something on the site breaks down. So a lot of pollution is flowing and adding to, in terms of methane, which is 86 times more powerful than CO2, contributing to climate change, and volatile organic compounds are health-harming carcinogens known to cause cancer, as well as respiratory issues, skin issues, among other negative health impacts. So this is a snapshot of what we see. This is, again, using our optical gas imaging camera. And you can sort of, it's different types of sites. And that was one of the things we've learned, is that big sites and small sites and new sites and old sites and big major operators and little independent operators, we find leaks and excess emissions at all different types of sites. Maybe just back up one to the other, to the Permian one. Thanks, Joan. And if you look in the upper right-hand corner on top of those tanks, what you see are workers who are being directly exposed to a venting tank, and they're not wearing any protective gear. So in addition to being worried about the environment and the communities and the climate, We also see and often witness exposure and situations in which oil and gas workers are putting their health at risk. And so this is some more examples. This slide here with those 4 images are from the counselor area. The last slide was from the Permian area. As a result of our work, we've gone out and I've probably seen more than 400 oil and gas sites in the last 2 years, and I filed more than 100 complaints. Most of them resulted in no action, and in terms of action, what we want is we want reduction of emissions, replacement of equipment, something that prevents more harm to communities and betters that situation. For the most part, very little action resulted from any of these complaints, in part because the enforcement system just doesn't have the capacity to get out in the field or to take on and do something about these complaints. This is a series of, this is a site where we filed 7 complaints. And so these are 3 examples of the same site. Each time we came back, sometimes it was the same emissions, sometimes it was different, but just how constant and pervasive these incidents are in these areas, and many of them. This is a site where there are many homes around and small ranches and some ag, some cotton and cattle just south of Carlsbad. So this is just a kind of a quick recap. There's a lot of activity going on, over 65,000 sites. The enforcement capacity just can't keep up. More than daily spills and emissions, especially in the Permian, particularly in the Permian. And our field work is finding problems and exceedances and spills and odors everywhere we go. And with COVID, we're seeing even less enforcement from regulators. They're not out in the field as much. We're seeing less of an industry presence, but they're still operating. And climate and frontline communities are the ones suffering that change and suffering that lack of eyes and even less enforcement. So today's conversation is so important because the way it's working, the way the system is set up, and the way supposed enforcement and oversight is set up is not enough to protect New Mexicans and even global. In terms of what's coming out of the Permian, there are global climate implications for the emissions that are projected in that area. Thanks.
So thank you so much, Nathalie. And I do not see Nick. Something might have come up. So if he comes on later, we'll just clue him in. So Larry, we'll just move on to you next. So thank you, Larry.
So I'm unmuted, right?
Yes, we can hear you, Larry. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Joan, for the invitation, and thanks to the other panelists and the other participants. I'm particularly thankful to Nathalie for starting us off with such a helpful overview. I actually had no idea we had 65,000 active wells and 138,000 people living close to the fields. Joan invited us to say something about ourselves if we wish. And I'm only saying that I'm tired, I'm anxious, and I'm optimistic. That was actually an article in the New York Times Sunday magazine, the front page, Voters' Mood, tired, anxious, and optimistic. I'm going to tell you why I'm optimistic first. Nancy Pelosi said today that environmental justice is a climate change issue, and that the House is preparing a far-reaching bill in response to climate. It won't pass the Senate, at least not in this term, but it will set us all up for election day decisions, as the Democratic candidates will carry this bill as a platform issue. It nicely converges with New Mexico's energy transition law, in that the Democratic bill has net zero emissions by 2050, 40% reduction by 2030, and by 2035, all new cars will emit zero greenhouse gases. So just be alert to the House of Representatives and that. Now, that's not as far-reaching as the Green New Deal, which is also got backing in the House, but it doesn't have a bill yet with it. However, with the Democratic bill that Nancy Pelosi announced today has Biden's support. So we're going in to the election with a bill that makes climate change and environmental justice front and center. So I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic today because NPL National released the Faith Voters Guide. And it underlines that this election is a values election like no other in a long while. And values is our terrain as people of faith. We know who and where the president is. We're not sure yet exactly who and where the electorate is. And we need to push the values issues to lift up what the choices are. And for Jews and Muslims and Native American traditions and Christians, the meeting place for all of this is environmental justice and healing among those who are at odds with one another in this society, and that's all of us in one form or another. So I'm optimistic because of the Values Voters Guide and what it's raising up for us for the election. I'm also optimistic because the Green Amendment may be able to do what Julian et al., the court case, wasn't in the end able to do, namely constitutionally guarantee a healthy environment for present and future generations. That court case, Julian et al., brought by the Children's Trust, failed by a 2-to-1 vote finally of judges. Now the judges said they were sympathetic, but they just didn't find sufficient legal precedent for moving on a bill for the well-being of future generations. And I think the Green Amendment could establish that by making its way into the constitutions of states to start with, but getting it rolling and do what Julian et al. Failed to do. So I'm optimistic about that possibility. I'm also optimistic because, as to quote the mayor, previous mayor out of Chicago, a good crisis is a terrible thing to waste. There are signs that people don't want to waste this crisis of the virus. And I'm looking to a response to the pandemic in some quarters that I think foreshadows a response to climate calamity. We hear everywhere, we're all in this together. And even if the responses haven't yet mastered the kind of the discipline of we shall overcome, there's an edge that feels like a movement waiting to happen here. The nation, even the world, seems very expectant, ready to venture some big changes, and with what feels to me like sufficient social solidarity to see them through. So maybe mobilizing to counter the pandemic foreshadows response to climate calamity as well. We've already seen the whole world can make a lot of changes quickly and together, mostly together, not all together at all, but we can make a lot of changes quickly and together around the world. We can rally and direct unprecedented mounds of money and other resources to very specific ends. We'll have to do that for climate calamity. We can find ways to do business and travel and education with means that leave us with cleaner air and reduced emissions and pollution. We can foster community resilience and show new ways to lift the spirit amidst what's obviously shared stress and strain. And that's happening. We can turn urgent attention together to the crippling shortcomings of the public health system and the crippling shortcomings of the economy too, as joblessness, poverty, crumbling infrastructure, inadequate housing, structural racism, structural inequality, they kind of parade naked across the stage these days, and people see them and want to respond. So I'm just saying that there's an impressive list of collective aspirations and actions that's already underway. To me, I'm an old man now. I don't remember FDR, even though I was around during his time. But to me, it feels like a 1930s FDR moment. This time, the New Deal will have to be a Green New Deal, or at least a Green Amendment deal as well. So it feels to me like 2020 is not the end of the world, but it's the end of a world. And that brings with it the hope for another world. Okay, let me finish by saying that those are the reasons I'm optimistic. The reasons I'm tired, everyone feels with as this goes on, the pandemic, and we don't see an end to it, it really wears us down, and I'm tired. I'm anxious because President Trump is in full demagogic mode, and that's going to increase and not decrease as we get closer in these months to the election. And the kind of chaos and and negative action that can happen under those circumstances can increase the anxiety as for the elections and maybe upset it some. So that's why I'm anxious. Nonetheless, overall then, I was, some sentences came to mind the night before last as I was trying to fall asleep, and they were again there in the morning. These will be familiar to most of you. It was the best of times, the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief. It was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light. It was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope. It was the winter of despair. Now, I didn't remember all of those from Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities. I remember the first part. But when I looked it up and read it, I said, that's where we are. It's the best of times. It may also be the worst of times. We need to brace for both. Thank you, Joan.
Thank you so much, Larry, very much. And Nick joined us now. So Nick, we're going to go ahead to you. And very pleased that you could jump on, Nick, way down in Carlsbad. And so we'll just share. I think, can I unmute you? You have to unmute yourself there.
Yes, I appreciate this time, and I apologize for getting on here late. My name is Nick King, and I'm a pastor with the Carlsbad Mennonite Church. I've been down here 7 years, and yes, it's an interesting culture to live in. This is the Wild West, West Texas area, where there's a lot of stuff going on. But as a Christian, I believe that the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, and it's not just ours or whoever has the money to exploit it. When I was down in Chile some 50 years ago, the question about who owned the copper ore was a big question. Is it those who have the money to exploit it and extract it, or is it the role of the government to do that? And I might propose that maybe it's a third way, that the earth is the Lord's, the fullness thereof, that's a common heritage for all of us to use and care for. That we are stewards of this great gift, that none of us own anything really for very long, that we need to take care of it and to take care of each other in this whole process and to love one another. Anyhow, a lot of times I see current attitudes down here where it's get what you can when you can, and you know, what's mine is mine, and I can do with it what I want to. A lot of short-sighted visions, attitudes of, you know, get what's economically good for me now. And that's the main law, instead of loving each other or watching for God's creation. As many of you know, the oil and gas is really booming here. This is a boom town. Boom and bust town has gone through all these cycles, and I don't know if that contributes to that kind of attitude of, you know, we got to get what we can now, but it's not a lot of forward thinking. Even investments are a lot of times very short term, like investing in mobile homes and pickup trucks that make a lot of smoke and noise. But those are short term investments. It's kind of the cycle of poverty, to put your money where it doesn't really last. And I think in the oil and gas industry, there's a lot of that, you know, rampant capitalism, that we get what we can. And there's land out there and there's oil there, we got to get it. And, whatever that costs, whatever that does to the environment. Also, we're dealing with Holtec down here and making this the nuclear waste dump of America. Not sure how that's going to play out yet, how benign that really is. But the long-term effects of that, I think, could be really a bad legacy to leave to our children. With the help of Joan and Nathalie, we have been able to get a group called Citizens Caring for the Future, or CCFF, down here. It's kind of a ragtag bunch that is trying to look for the future and especially deal with air pollution, methane emissions, and stuff that there might be a handle on. Earthworks has helped us with getting the FLIR camera down here so people can see what is not visible to the naked eye, all the emissions, leaks, pollution coming from most all of these installations, and seeing what we can do about that. We've had Representative Torres Small come down here and look at that, and I think that was impressive for us, and I think it was also impressive for her to be able to see what the naked eye can't see as far as pollution, and see what we can do to be good stewards of this earth for the good of everybody and not just for a few. We've also had Dr. Ann Epstein from Texas Tech come down and give a talk on health effects of all this pollution, and that was well attended. We've done a bunch of other smaller stuff and continue to do that, and appreciate Joan and Nathalie's input in bringing this kind of stuff to us as a kind of education and support for what's going on here for the good of everybody, not just only our area, but the whole state, nation, and world. And I'll let it go with that. Thanks for the opportunity.
Nick, thank you very much, and thanks for your ethical, spiritual leadership and your leadership in New Mexico. It's very important. Thank you so much. And Terry, why don't we have you next? And Terry, you're on mute. There you go. Great.
Sorry about that. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for being here tonight. And also, Joan, thank you for this opportunity to speak to everybody on this most important issue of addressing our climate crisis, our environmental climate crisis, and also to talk about the Green Amendment. I am the director of my NGO called Southwest Native Cultures, but I'm also a board member of Maya's Green Amendments for the Generations. So I'm also here representing that perspective. But I was asked to kind of touch base on how it is the native and indigenous perspective of what we're seeing in the environmental issue of the environmental catastrophe or the destruction of our lands, air, and water that I see, that I have heard, and that we have continued to feel from other groups and peoples around New Mexico and the country around the world. I'm also an accredited member through Southwest Native Cultures of the United Nations, where my work has focused on climate change, environmental issues, and working on indigenous peoples issues. And one of the biggest things that we do look at and have looked at is the destruction of our lands from an environmental perspective, from oil and gas development, mining, uranium, etc. But I kind of wanted to, touch base on a little bit on what the Navajo culture. I'm Navajo and Hopi, and the Navajo culture kind of touches base on certain beliefs. And I'm going to read you a perspective from a gentleman that did a piece on Navajo culture, Navajo belief. It is believed that centuries ago, the holy people taught the Dine how to live the right way and to conduct their many acts of everyday life. They were taught to live in harmony with Mother Earth, Father Sky, and the many other elements such as man, animals, plants, and insects. The holy people put our 4 sacred mountains in 4 different directions. Mount Blanca to the east, Mount Taylor to the south, San Francisco Peaks to the west, Mount Hesperus to the north, thus creating Navajo land. The 4 directions are represented by 4 colors. White shell represents the east, turquoise the south, yellow abalone the west, and jet black the north. We were also taught to that in our belief that we follow certain aspects of our life that lead to good harmony. He continues to say, there is good in harmony, the harmony of the Navajo and the universe and all living creatures on earth. When he lives in accordance with the universe, he can expect the wealth of a clean soul that protects the whole being from evil that preys upon his sacred dwellings. The hogan, which is a traditional Navajo home, is built in the manner of this harmony. The roof is in the likeness of the sky. The walls are in the likeness of the Navajo surroundings. The upward position of the mountains, hills, and trees. And the floor is ever in touch with Earth Mother. So from this, you can kind of get an understanding that the traditional way of Navajo life and existence evolves around Mother Earth, our fellow man, brother and sisters, our animals, plants, etc. So we strive to kind of find that harmony in our lives. There's a common core that exists in our traditional Navajo way of religion, and that's the concept of Hajo. The Navajo word Hajo refers to a harmonious and ideal environment. It is beauty, harmony, goodness, happiness, and everything that is positive. And it refers to an environment which is all-inclusive, our harmonious existence. The Green Amendment then, to me, ties into Hajo in its ability in a state's Bill of Rights section of their Constitution to recognize and protect the all-inclusive, inalienable rights of all people to clean, sacred water, air, land, a stable climate, and a healthy environment. Now, I really appreciated the slide presentation that Nathalie provided us, and it showed us exactly the desecration we're seeing with our land, our air and water. I mean, the thing that we don't hear about in that perspective is we don't see and hear about the explosions and the fires that occurred to those residents that live in the area. We have many colleagues that live in that area, in the council area, that saw an explosion years ago where a hogan was almost demolished. Emergency crews had to come. There's a fire that was created, and it burned for days after the explosion because it was actually a well site that burned. And then we hear horrible stories of when I presented at the United Nations several years ago, I talked about the Gold King mine spill, where we saw the spill that contaminated all the way down into the Colorado River through the Animas River. And in that discussion, I talked about how in the Counselor region, the local elementary school has to close their windows during the day because the smell is so bad from the methane emissions that they can't concentrate. And it affected the children's breathing, etc. So they had to do that as a daily part of their lives and living with oil and gas development just several hundred feet from their school. So these are issues that are consistently bothering and affecting our Native people. And you want to see how, I mean, I want to try to then tie in how that works with the Green Amendment. I believe the Green Amendment in and of itself could be the savior of things. Maya might not say that's the case, but I think the Green Amendment, and that's why I supported it when I first heard about it from Maya, was that it creates the ability to build into our Bill of Rights and the state's constitution protections for land, air, and water, for a clean a stable climate, and of course a clean, healthful environment. And I think once something like that is built into a state's constitution, we can utilize it as a backing or support on fighting contamination or violations by the OCDs, by them not holding violators accountable, etc. Because what we found, I'm bouncing around, but I actually worked on the Sandoval County Oil and Gas Ordinance Development Team. And the one thing that we found is that in reporting accidents and so forth to the state, it's all voluntary. So, there's probably thousands and thousands of more accidents that are not reported, and we're only seeing those that are probably severe enough to be reported. And unfortunately, the Oil Conservation Division does not mandate further reporting at that level. So I believe that, if with the Green Amendment, we have a great chance to remedy those issues and those situations and really begin to bring to life a better climate that we could probably see here in New Mexico, and continue to see the wonderful sunsets we see, our wonderful rivers and our green lakes and our green lands and our forests. And that's kind of why I'm part of Maya's board to help fight for that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Terry, and for sharing some of your precious parts about your culture and heritage and spiritual tradition. Thank you so much. And Maya, Lise, oh, there you are. You're starting already. All right.
I thought I know we're being cautious about time, and I've got my timer. So I thought I'd jump right in, unless you wanted to say something, Joan?
No, go ahead. Thank you.
Great. So I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all tonight, and the wonderful, insightful words and perspectives and information of all the panelists has been so helpful to lay the land here for tonight's conversation. One of the things I thought, though, that I should do is, I know there are a lot of familiar faces on this webinar, in this Zoominar, who have heard me speak about the Green Amendment, but I think that there are also some people who haven't. So I wanted to quickly go through and make sure that we're all on the same page. So as we go forth in discussion, everybody has an appreciation of what the Green Amendment is, but also what it has done in the 2 states where it exists. So as Terry wonderfully said and Joan said, I am with the new national organization called Green Amendments for the Generations, which is getting increasingly active in the state of New Mexico. But the thing that I think is most important for me, for you to know about me, is that I've been doing environmental advocacy and litigation for over 26 years now. And it's as a result of that 26 years of work of fighting for the earth and fighting for our communities that I've come to this place of recognition that our current system of environmental protection laws in every state across the nation and at the national level are truly failing us, and that we need a new path for environmental protection. And you know, as we've heard tonight, and as I think everybody coming to this conversation understands, is we know we need a new path because we can see all of the environmental degradation and devastation actually happening on the landscapes, right? And I don't think you need much more to convince you that there's a problem with what's happening in how we protect the environment, other than seeing how lives and communities and our Mother Nature are being devastated. And the problem, there is a fundamental problem. The reason why this is happening is because of the fundamental problem with our current system of government and the way we go about protecting the environment through all of these thousands and thousands of environmental protection laws that we have in place in New Mexico, in every state across our nation, and at the federal level. And fundamentally, the problem, there are several laws that are common, or several problems common to across the legal landscapes in every state across our nation. First off, the way our system of government is operating in New Mexico and across our nation, the way our laws are written, our laws and our government are designed to have us think about pollution and degradation at the end of the decision-making process, whether we're legislating, permitting, or whatever. At the end of the process, that's when we think about how are we going to manage the pollution and the degradation that we have accepted as a foregone conclusion through this government decision-making process and system of laws. Our system of government and laws are not structured so that we start from day one thinking, how can we prevent pollution? How can we prevent degradation? There are also many gaps in the laws, a lot of things that aren't covered. All too often, there's poor implementation of the laws that we do have on the books, and inevitably, at one point or another, somebody who does not respect the power and importance of a healthy environment works very quickly and tirelessly to roll back even the protections that we do have on the books. And of course, with the way these laws are written and the way these laws are implemented, there is absolutely built-in racism, right? Indigenous communities, communities of color are not targeted for environmental sacrifice zones in spite of the laws that we have in place. They are targeted because of these laws, because of how they are written and how they are intentionally implemented. And so we can see truly with that system of government is that there is something missing. And so the question is, what? And actually, Terry, I would agree with you that a Green Amendment could be this powerful savior if we use it that way. So the question really is, sorry with that little diversion, you know, what is that something missing? Well, actually in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, there was a Pennsylvania senator who realized what he believed and what I believe is that something missing, or at least a very important something missing. The fact that we do not protect our inalienable rights to clean water and air, a stable climate, and a healthy environment in the same way we protect those other inalienable human, civil, and political rights we hold dear. We don't recognize and protect our environmental rights in the Bill of Rights section of our state and federal constitutions, and pronounce to government that these rights, these inalienable rights, are not to be infringed upon, are not to be taken from the people through government action or inaction. And so because of his recognition of this gap in the way we structure our laws in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, or in the nation and in Pennsylvania when it comes to the environment, Senator Curry, Pennsylvania Senator Curry, was responsible for actually having an amendment that recognized and protect the rights of all people, including future generations, to pure water, clean air, and a healthy environment, and having those rights recognized in the Bill of Rights section of the Constitution, where we recognize and protect all those other fundamental rights and freedoms that we hold dear. There is actually only one other state that gives this most powerful, highest recognition and protection to our environment and environmental rights here in the United States of America, and that's the state of Montana. Only Pennsylvania and Montana have what I define to be a green amendment. And there are a lot of fundamentals, but essentially a green amendment is an environmental rights amendment that's in the Bill of Rights section of the Constitution that recognizes and protects the rights of all people, including future generations, and protects those rights the same way we protect those other fundamental freedoms we hold dear. When now thinking about the topic of fracking, right? Pennsylvania's Green Amendment has been used very powerfully in the fracking context. Now, fracking came to the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania before we had a living, vibrant Green Amendment in the state. And that's a whole nother story. You can read the book or hear my other talk to get that story. But when this Green Amendment got its legal life in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, we were able to use it to take on a very pro-fracking law that had been passed in 2012 by the Pennsylvania legislature, which gave the fracking industry all kinds of gifts, like the power of eminent domain when it came to gas storage, and automatic waivers from environmental protection standards, and lots more. When this law was passed in 2012, as I said, drilling and fracking was already happening in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. But if this law had been allowed to go forth and be implemented, the devastating impacts of fracking would have been dramatically worse. My organization, the Delaware Riverkeeper Network, decided that we were going to challenge this law based on that Pennsylvania Green Amendment, Article 1, Section 27. And in December of 2013, we got a decision out of a very conservative Pennsylvania Supreme Court, which recognized that drilling and fracking, and this law, if it had been allowed to advance, will produce a detrimental effect on the environment and the people and their children and future generations. And that the resources that were being harmed were resources essential to life, to health, and to liberty. And that as a result, according to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, this pro-fracking law was to be, at least the provisions we were challenging, were to be declared unconstitutional because they violated the environmental rights of the people of Pennsylvania. And in that moment, with that victory, we stopped that law dead in its tracks. And so those provisions could never advance in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and make things worse. And at the same time, we set really important precedent that would help us in other victories yet to come that we are still working on today. As we think about how a Green Amendment can make a difference, I just gave you one example of how a Green Amendment has been used to pull back a devastating piece of legislation. We have used the Green Amendment in Pennsylvania to prevent the misuse of environmental protection funds for the general operating budget rather than the environment. We have used the Green Amendment to force the voiding or the rescission of permitting for environmentally dangerous practices. There are a variety of them. We are using the Green Amendment right now to enforce or to advance drinking water standards from PFOA, PFAS drinking water contamination, and to force the cleanup of a long ignored hazardous site right in the heart of a residential community. In Montana, they too have used their Green Amendment to force the rescission or the voiding of dangerous gold mining permits and to prevent the government from enforcing a contract that would put at risk drinking water supplies. So these Green Amendments really do have meaningful power and effect. And I believe, and as we've been doing this work, I really believe that there really is in these victories a message for all of us, that really our rights to a healthy environment are worthy of constitutional recognition and protection, and that we should go forth across our nation and get green amendments like Pennsylvania and Montana has in every single state constitution across our nation, and then ultimately at the federal level. There's tremendous energy for this idea in the state of New Mexico. And so we're working hard and really building this. And tonight's program is part of talking about how a green amendment could make a difference. I'm going to do one other thing, but then I'm at 11 minutes and I really want to stop. But I do want you to know, many people think Article 20, Section 21 is comparable to a green amendment, and it is not. What it does, Article 20, Section 21 promises that your legislature will pass environmental protection laws. Well, they do that, and therefore they have fulfilled their constitutional obligation. But yet we still see all the problems that we're talking about this evening. It just does not fulfill all the fundamental requisites of a green amendment, being in the Bill of Rights section of the Constitution, protecting the rights of the people, not just making a promise that more laws are going to be passed. There are some specifics. I had broad brush strokes about how a green amendment would be implemented, but I really think that the conversation is what people are eager to get to. So perhaps I'll just leave it at that, and we can jump right to the conversation. I do want people to know, if you go to www.nmgreenamendment.org. There's an organizational sign-on letter and a petition and lots of other information that you can turn to get engaged, get involved, and support this powerful idea for the state of New Mexico.
Thank you so much, Maya. Thank you very much. So we have a few minutes left here. I'd like to just open it up to the panelists. If there are any reactions or thoughts that you would like to respond to one another or to any of the questions that were in the chat box. And then if we have some time after that, we'll just open it up for other questions. And it would be helpful if people have questions, if they could just put them in the chat box, because that saves, you know, some time and we can look at those ahead of time. So from our panelists, do any of you have any other thoughts or comments that you would like to make?
Joan,
Yes.
this is Larry. I have too many of them for our time, but let me start. I would greatly appreciate all of them, and in particular, I think the presentation from Maya. I only want to say that I think that in the upcoming months, the battleground will be a battleground about rights already. And so the question, which rights do we protect? Which rights aren't getting attention at all or little attention is a very, very important kind of approach and question. And we've already heard from, in this case, the Vice President of the United States, talk about the response to the pandemic in terms of freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, and then in other contexts, the Second Amendment rights on guns. These are all taken up as, in Pence says, you know, you've got a constitutional right, so that if you don't want to maintain social distance or wear a mask, you don't have to. That's the Constitution. So I just think that for us to be pushing the Green Amendment and in New Mexico fulfilling some of the obligations already in law, to pick it up as a matter of rights is really important. And I'll just say one more thing quickly in response to Nick and Terry. Well, I very much appreciated Nick's comments, the earth is the Lord's. I will say that steward in this culture is a reference to taking care of what you own, whereas the biblical notion of steward is taking care precisely of what you don't own. It's the creators, and that's your responsibility. But it never comes out that way. And I myself kind of prefer the Quran, where it talks about us human beings as companions of the garden, or partners in St. Francis's terms. If we're going to use steward, then we have to say it's because we're responsible, as Terry did, for what we don't own. And lastly, in response to Terry, I'm teaching Braiding Sweetgrass, which is a book by a Potawatomi botanist, Robert Wall Kimmer. And one of the most important lines in the book, it's a book on indigenous wisdom, scientific knowledge, and the teachings of plants. But one of the most important sentences in the book is, it's all in the pronouns. You wouldn't say of your grandmother, it's making us chocolate chip cookies. You wouldn't say of your grandmother, it's braiding my hair. But she's a thou and not an it. But we treat the rest of nature, which is our grandmother and mother, and apart from which we have no life whatsoever, as it. And that's wrong. It's all in the pronouns. If you get the pronouns right, you'll probably treat the rest of nature better. That's my comments.
Thank you, Larry. Other comments from our panelists?
I wanted to, thanks, Joan. Just briefly, so thankful for everyone's comments and thinking about some of the additional information that Maya shared and thinking about how broken the system is. I think one piece of this too is the lack of community or public or indigenous voice, and the way the system is set up is the onus and the burden is on the public or the impacted community member to prove harm, as opposed to the industry to prove that it's safe. And that gets back to your comment, Maya, about where it starts and where some of that input and just sort of the setting of the stage, and the system is set up to proceed and then figure the problem out later, and we know what that results in. It results in an impossible situation that we can't perpetuate. So that was just sort of sharing that. I wanted to share, I shared so many non-positive things or non-optimistic things. We did have a little ray of hope and sunshine in New Mexico in terms of complaints, in that the Environment Department, of its own volition, started issuing letters of potential violation in response to what they're calling constituent complaints, which include what Earthworks has submitted as complaints using our optical gas imaging videos. But it's basically unprecedented in the country for a state regulator to accept anything except their own evidence for any kind of enforcement action. And so that is, it's a tiny crumb, and it's not enough given the volume of things, but it is a step in, and it's something that when working with some of the community members in council, when I shared that, it was a little bit of hope and optimism and empowerment that a voice is being heard and that a concern is reflected and action is taken. And those 7 letters, 4 or 5 of those sites resulted in improvements on the site. It's temporary, but it's not something NMED had to do. As opposed to Texas, they actually have regulations that say they can rely on third-party evidence, and they don't. And I've asked Colorado to, and they refuse. So it's still the broken system that we're working within, but it's a little bit of a response in an otherwise very difficult, publicly inaccessible system in New Mexico.
So could I just offer, and Nathalie's really important point about the precautionary principle. I think that that's one of the very powerful transformational shifts that a Green Amendment helps create. I mean, there's so many. It's just an entirely different way of thinking about the environment and environmental rights. Mostly people don't think about the environment. They're told you have a right to clean water and clean air, but until they actually hear me tell them, no, you don't, because it's not in the Bill of Rights section, it's sort of a little bit of a jolt. So there are a lot of ways that it transforms the way we think about and embrace the environment, but also the way we protect it legally. And one of the things it does is it really does install into the government decision-making process the precautionary principle. If your Green Amendment is properly written and framed, which we hope and believe New Mexico's will be, is it really mandates, requires the government to engage in informed decision-making, to think about the science and the impacts, both the individual impacts and the cumulative impacts of the decision that they're about to make, or the law they're about to take, or the permit that they're about to issue before they do it. Because if they don't engage in informed decision-making, they cannot fulfill their trustee obligation as articulated in the Green Amendment. This is not the public trust doctrine. This is about being a trustee of the natural resources in the way a lawyer might be or a bank might be a trustee for a pot of money for beneficiaries. And that kind of trust law brings with it responsible, informed decision-making as part of its fiduciary obligations. And we have demonstrated in a couple of cases in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, sometimes cases that went to decision-making, sometimes cases where the agency pulled back because they realized they couldn't meet this standard, but being able to demonstrate that constitutionally, if the government cannot demonstrate that it did in fact consider the science, the specific facts, the specific impacts, the cumulative impacts of the permit or the law or the regulation or the undertaking they were about to undertake, they couldn't defend it constitutionally. And so that decision got struck down and sent back to ensure informed decision-making. So a properly done Green Amendment really does help install into the government process the idea of the precautionary principle, not do it now, think about the consequences later and try to figure out how you're gonna prove that you did no harm when in fact you did do lots of harm, right? So that was a really great point, Nathalie, and I'm glad you brought it up because it was amongst the slides that I didn't have time to get to show the way a Green Amendment can be very powerful in transforming government decision-making.
Thank you so much, Maya and Nathalie and Larry. Do any of the other panelists have comments or thoughts that they'd like to make? Okay.
I do, Joan.
Oh, great. Go ahead, Terry.
This is in regards to Larry's thoughts on steward of the land. One thing I didn't talk about is in our Hopi culture, we have a gentleman or being called Masa, and he's like the caretaker of our land. And it was through him that the Hopi got permission to live where they live. And so he was the one that provided them the means to live there. And he holds the trust of the Creator. So I thought maybe when you get a chance, Larry, look up the Masa and the Hopi culture. In fact, this is interesting because where my family's land is in Kikotsmovi, out in Hopi, supposedly it's near where Masa walked on our land. So our land and our family, the Sakiesti is near where Masa walked at one point. So, yeah. But yeah, that's it. Thanks.
Thank you, Terry. So many rich things and perspectives that each of our panelists have offered us tonight. We're just so grateful for this wisdom and life experiences and tradition and culture. And thank you so much. Well, I have 7:45 and we were going to go for an hour and 15 minutes. And so I guess maybe just to end, Maya, maybe you could just share briefly before we go, what people could do if they want to get on board and help learn more and promote the Green Amendment in the state. And just to let people know that New Mexico Interfaith Power and Light will be working on this as well. And so you can always connect with us and we'll be putting forth things. But Maya, maybe you could just share just for a moment. Maya, you're on mute.
Sorry, I got so excited. Thank you for that opportunity. And really, the partnership of Interfaith Power and Light is really wonderful. And we are looking so forward to our collaboration because you are such a powerful and important voice in all things environmental protection. And we're so grateful. So if people go to nmgreenamendment.org, right? And I did put it in the chat box. We have a number of opportunities there. First off, if you are part of an organization, this could be an environmental organization, a community organization, a church group, a business, right? Any sort of entity that has a name that represents a collective, you know, we could really use your support in signing on to the organizational sign-on letter that we can use to show we being the collective, we meaning all of us, right, can use to show legislators and decision makers how much support and growing support there is for this pathway. There's also a petition for individuals to sign up. And one of the things that happens is when you've sort of signed on in support, you've you're vetted. And then we start to circle you into a Google group. We're going to be putting in place regular chats where anybody can get on to share their ideas. We've been trying to get these things off of the ground for a little bit, and they were going really well, and then the pandemic hit and everything went poof, but we're getting our feet back under us again. So really, those are two near-term things. If you can help us identify organizations that we should be talking with one-on-one or community groups, you know, really, right now we're in a spread the word kind of mode. You could also reach out to your own legislators, right? We are also in the process of informing legislators. We actually, Senator Antoinette Cedillo Lopez is very excited about being our champion for advancing a Green Amendment, but we have a number of legislators that we have attended speaking engagements or speaking events where I've been at, and we've had these kinds of conversations, and there are a number who are really interested, excited, and already expressing support. We need them to hear from you, and we need those who haven't heard about the Green Amendment yet, or those who are running for office and want to be the one to represent you in government. We need all government officials to be starting to be exposed to this idea of constitutional environmental rights added to the Bill of Rights section of the Constitution in the form of a Green Amendment. So reaching out to your legislators, you could also do that through our website or do that directly. However you do it, we ask you to please let us know who you've connected with, who you've contacted, what you've heard from them. Be part of our collective effort to inform and engage others. So that's my broad strokes, but we are really working to grow the collaborative in a very engaged way, and are hoping that now that we've sort of are getting our feet back under us, that we will be able to do that in a really meaningful way for everybody.
Great, Maya, that's a lot right there, even just to start with. So that's wonderful, because, you know, so many people on the call have different organizations, churches, you know, mosques, groups that they're part of, and to spread the word, and friends and neighbors and individuals. And so it's kind of a grassroots movement that we have to get going here. So that's right. The greening. So that's great. Well, with that note, I think I just want to thank again so much our panelists tonight who took out this time from their evening, but also to share their wisdom, what's important to them, and to share it with all of us. And so I want to thank Nathalie and Nick and Larry and Terry and Maya, who was in a different time zone, so she's tired and needs to go to bed. It's way past her bedtime now. So I just want to thank you all very much. And you have the website to go to. You can go to NM IPL. We'll be working on this as well. And let's all just continue to do the good work we have and also offer our prayers and thoughts. And also, in Indivisible in Nob Hill, we'll have a presentation with Maya in a few weeks. And then also, there's a group, Nick mentioned the Holtec issue, and there's a group that's involved in nuclear concerns. They're going to be having Maya speak also. So Maya, on your website, does it have a list of all the places you're giving these presentations in our state?
Yes, there's a calendar page, and then on the New Mexico specific page, when things are scheduled, they get added there. And I would love to be in connection with you, Nick, about Holtec. There's an interesting connection between New Mexico and New Jersey, which is part of my beautiful Delaware River watershed. And we are doing comments on that, as well as thinking about it from the Green Amendment perspective. So
wonderful. Well, with that note, thank you, everyone. Blessings to you all, and thank you for all of your good work and your prayers and your efforts, and being together in this journey on our common home to take care of one another and this sacred place that we live. So thank you very, very much. And to be continued.
Yeah.
yes.
Everyone.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.